Read the news today and it may appear we are not of this earth. The monolithic way in which we thought the world was organized has fractured. Everything we once knew as fixed, certain, and comfortably labeled seems to be up for interpretation. We are living in a time when identity itself is fluid, when being one thing does not preclude you from being another. And while this modern sense of self may feel like a uniquely contemporary phenomenon, the automobile world was wrestling with similar questions decades ago. In 1972, at the dawn of a new and uncertain era for performance cars, Plymouth built a machine that could not easily be defined by traditional categories. It was both one thing and another. It was a performance car and a survivor of changing times. It was a road runner that wore GTX badges. It was the 1972 Plymouth Road Runner GTX, a car that asked in its own steel and chrome way what it truly meant to be itself. To understand how such a dual-identity car came to be, one must revisit the fertile, roaring late 1960s when Plymouth's muscle line was not only strong but proud. The GTX, introduced in 1967, was meant to be the gentleman's hot rod. It was muscular, powerful, and sophisticated. Under its hood sat a 440 cubic inch Super Commando V8 with 375 horsepower, a serious amount of force in an age obsessed with speed. Its trim and finish leaned toward the upscale. It was based on the Sport Satellite, the more refined member of Plymouth's mid-size family. A year later, as if to appeal to the working man who wanted performance without pretense, Plymouth introduced the Road Runner, based on the more modest Belvedere platform and powered by a 383. It was brash, cartoonish, and unashamedly blue-collar. For several glorious years, the two models lived side by side, siblings, opposites, and rivals. The GTX was tailored and polished. The Road Runner was stripped and scrappy. Both shared a spirit of speed, but they wore it differently. Yet as the calendar turned to the early 1970s, the air began to thin. Insurance rates skyrocketed for performance models. Federal emissions regulations tightened. Leaded fuel was on its way out, and the golden age of the high-compression V8 was fading fast. By 1971, the GTX was living on borrowed time. Plymouth's once glorious sales charts began to show alarming declines. The Road Runner, though still the brand's performance standard-bearer, could no longer deliver the unrestrained punch of previous years. Compression ratios dropped. Horsepower figures followed suit. The muscle car dream was, for all practical purposes, ending not in a crash but in a slow, regulated surrender. With only 2,942 GTX units produced in 1971, the writing was on the wall. Plymouth, ever pragmatic, decided to fold the GTX into the Road Runner lineup for 1972. The logic was both marketing and mechanical. Since the standalone GTX had become redundant and costly, its identity would now be absorbed by the Road Runner. But this merger came with an interesting twist. The 444-barrel engine, previously exclusive to the GTX, was made available as an option for the Road Runner. When you ordered the 440, your car received subtle GTX badging on the fenders and trunk lid. There was no formal GTX package. It was simply a matter of ordering the right engine, and your Road Runner became something more than itself. To the casual observer, it might have seemed confusing. Was it a Road Runner or a GTX? The answer, of course, was both. The car wore two names with quiet confidence, refusing to choose between them. It embodied a rare moment in Detroit history when a single machine captured the tension of a changing time, the transition from muscle to moderation, from excess to endurance. In 1972, emissions regulations forced manufacturers to lower compression ratios drastically. Plymouth's once mighty 440, now breathing through smaller carburetors and tamer timing curves, produced less power than before, but it was still formidable. It had torque for days, and in an era when competitors were neutering their engines even more severely, the Road Runner GTX remained one of the few cars that could still deliver genuine performance. Beneath the skin, Plymouth engineers worked hard to maintain as much of the old spirit as possible. When equipped with the 440 and a 4-speed manual transmission, the Road Runner GTX received the coveted Dana 60 rear axle, an emblem of serious intent. This same heavy-duty rear had been reserved for earlier high-horsepower Mopars, from Hemi-Chargers to 440 six-pack Road Runners. But in 1972, only the 444-speed Road Runner GTX got it. Automatics made do with lighter rears, reflecting Plymouth's retreat from the aggressive gearing that once defined its muscle cars. The reason was simple: low-compression engines no longer needed or could handle 4.10 gears. The best you could get with a TorqueFlite automatic was a 3.55 ratio, practical but hardly heroic. The four-speed cars, however, retained the option of the A33 track pack, which brought the Dana rear with 3.54 gears, a SureGrip differential, a 7-blade torque drive fan, and a 26-inch radiator with a fan shroud, details that whispered, rather than shouted, performance. Today, looking at one of these cars in pristine condition, one senses a quiet confidence rather than the brash bravado of earlier models. The lines remain taut and muscular, the proportions unmistakably Mopar. Yet there was a maturity about it, a recognition that the days of unrestrained horsepower were gone. And in that maturity, something beautiful emerged. A car that understood its limitations and made the most of them. The example at hand, a GY9 Tawny Gold 1972 Plymouth Road Runner GTX, perfectly captures this balance between old glory and new restraint. One of only 219 built with the 444-barrel and 4-speed combination, it is both rare and revealing. The car's restoration, according to its seller, was done on a solid body with careful attention to authenticity. Documentation from Chrysler and the original dealership in Imlay City, Michigan, adds weight to its provenance. It's a car that carries history not only in its VIN plate but in its very philosophy. A reflection of Plymouth's last stand for performance before the energy crisis and emissions era fully reshaped American automotive culture. Its specifications read like a greatest hits album of Mopar's late muscle period. Under the hood sits a 440-board .030 over, breathing through aluminum heads, modern improvements that subtly enhance performance while maintaining originality. The car features gold bucket seats, a center console, and the Decor group trim, giving the interior a restrained luxury that complements the car's external understatement. Power steering and brakes make it civil on the road, while the Rally instrument cluster and AM/FM radio nod to its driver-oriented intent. The air grabber hood, coded N96, remains one of the car's defining visual cues, a vacuum-operated system that exposed a hood scoop when the driver demanded more air and more attitude. Originally, the invoice called for gold strobe striping, but this example now wears black, providing a touch of contrast against the tawny gold paint. On its 14-inch Rally wheels, the car sits poised, not too aggressive, not too docile. It looks ready for a late afternoon cruise down a sunlit highway, its big block burble resonating through the calm of modern traffic like an echo from another age. For those who remember what these cars represented, the 1972 Road Runner GTX is more than just metal and paint. It's a bridge between eras. It's the link between the thunderous 1968 to 1970 seasons of raw power and the sobered-up, emissions-conscious years that followed. It tells a story of adaptation and survival. When other automakers abandoned their performance badges entirely, Plymouth found a way to keep the flame alive, even if smaller, dimmer, and more nuanced. The idea that this car identifies as a road runner but wears GTX badges feels poetic in retrospect. In an age obsessed with labels, the Road Runner GTX resisted definition. It was neither purely one nor purely the other, but something in between, something transitional, much like the culture that produced it. The early 1970s were not just about changing technology. They were about changing expectations. Speed was no longer the only measure of worth. Durability, comfort, and compliance began to matter more. The muscle car had to evolve or die, and in that evolution, identity itself became fluid. Driving a 1972 Road Runner GTX today is an act of time travel, not just through the decades but through ideas. You sit behind the wheel, grip the shifter, and feel the weight of both history and compromise. The clutch is firm but forgiving. The engine idles with a deep, steady lope that's more civilized than its predecessors but still potent. You depress the throttle, and the car surges forward, not with the manic urgency of a 426 Hemi, but with confident, unhurried strength. This power that doesn't need to prove itself anymore. There's a kind of grace in that restraint, The 1972 Road Runner GTX was built for a world that no longer wanted tire smoke on every corner. It was built for people who still loved performance but were ready to accept maturity. When you drive one, you feel that duality, the car urging you to have fun while also reminding you that the fun doesn't need to be reckless. In a way, it mirrors our own cultural journey from unbridled youth to responsible adulthood. For collectors, these cars occupy a fascinating niche. They're rarer than their late 60s counterparts, but often overlooked. Their subdued horsepower ratings and transitional styling make them less glamorous in the eyes of casual enthusiasts. Yet, for those who understand the deeper story, they hold immense appeal. They represent not the peak of the muscle car era but its pivot point, the moment when Detroit learned to balance desire with reality. The Tawny Gold example's restoration underscores that sense of reverence for survival. Every nut and bolt tells a story of perseverance. Every line of the body speaks of the hands that shaped it to endure a new world. It's easy to romanticize the 1968 Road Runner with its beep-beep, horn, and brash humor. But the 1972 Road Runner GTX has something subtler to offer. It's about endurance, identity, and self-awareness. A machine that knows exactly what it is, even when others can't decide how to define it. If one were to see it idling at a stoplight, the GTX badges gleaming faintly under the sun, one might ask, is that a Road Runner? And the answer, with a knowing smile, would be yes and no, because this car isn't interested in simple answers. It's a reminder that identity, whether mechanical or human, often exists in the in-between. At a price of $79,900, this particular car invites not just ownership but reflection. What you buy is not merely a collector's item or a restored relic. It's a piece of the conversation between eras. You buy the sound of a 440 breathing through a new century, the feeling of gears meshing as they did half a century ago, the paradox of a car that was born out of compromise yet stands today as a symbol of persistence. In the grand tapestry of American automotive history, the 1972 Plymouth Road Runner GTX occupies a unique thread. It's not the loudest or the fastest, but it is one of the most honest. It doesn't hide from the realities of its time, it embodies them. And in doing so, it achieves something few cars ever do. It becomes a reflection not just of engineering, but of the human condition. The need to adapt, the courage to change, the refusal to disappear. When you close your eyes and listen to its engine idle, you can almost hear the fading echoes of the muscle era, the glory days when cubic inches ruled and gas was cheap. But you can also hear something new, the sound of endurance, of a legacy finding new life in restraint. The Road Runner GTX was not the end of an era, but a translation of one, a dialect spoken softly where once it had been shouted. Half a century later, that dialect still speaks. Tells us that identity, like horsepower, isn't always about excess. Sometimes it's about balance, authenticity, and the quiet confidence of knowing who you are, even when the world insists you choose a label. The 1972 Plymouth Road Runner GTX chose both, and in doing so, it became timeless.